Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. One of the most important battle spaces in that war at the moment is, unfortunately, right here on the home front. A man who has devoted much of his professional career to assessing, understanding, and helping the rest of us address the fact that we have what I think are best described as enemies within, is our first guest. His name is Kyle Shideler. He is a friend and colleague of mine at the Center for Security Policy, where he is a senior analyst and directs our program on homeland security and counterterrorism. He's also the editor and a contributor to an important, relatively new book, Unmasking Antifa, something we're going to do with him here today. Kyle, welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. It's so good to have you with us.
Frank, it's good to be here.
I wanted to start with basically a threshold question. We've seen a lot of imagery of these guys all kitted out in black helmets and coverings and gear and such, doing awful things across our country. But I think for many of us, the question persists, who are these guys and why are they doing what they're doing?
There are absolutely organizations known as Antifa. They are interlinked with other Antifa organizations in a network. They cooperate, they share funds, they share money, they move around the country in support of each other. They are, by really any definition that a prosecutor would use in the court of law, a criminal conspiracy and a criminal organization.
And you mentioned what they want. What exactly is their goal?
So at the 50,000-foot level, their objective is really the overthrow of the government, of the Constitution, and really of all governments everywhere. They are primarily anarchists or anarcho-communists, or what is sometimes called autonomists, which means that they seek Marxist revolution. But unlike the traditional Leninist, Maoist communists we're familiar with, rather than seizing control of the state and implementing a dictatorship, they hope to abolish the state and rule in a Marxist, anarchist method. So what you end up seeing is things like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle during the riots of 2020, where they were able to successfully force out the police from about a 6-block zone, and then they briefly ruled that area in their anarcho-communist way, which involved largely extorting local businesses, shooting innocent teenagers, and generally causing mayhem. But they are genuinely very serious about this idea. They absolutely believe in overthrowing the government. They absolutely believe in establishing a Marxist non-state.
And what would you say, if you were to generalize, of course, but what is the character of the demographic that populates these sort of groups that are most, I guess, associated, certainly in recent months, with violent action in the streets aimed at either destroying public buildings, police precincts, federal courthouses, or, as you say, in some instances, actually taking territory and trying to hold it, at least for a time?
I mean, the general recruit is high school or college age, at least for the foot soldier. They recruit very heavily among sort of homeless teenagers and troubled youth. They recruit heavily among individuals with various identity issues, whether that's their sexual identity or their racial identity or what have you. But troubled youth, they target pretty aggressively. They target people who have a propensity to commit violence. That's why you see, people scooped up in these Antifa riots and actually charged. They typically have long criminal records in the past, even before they engaged in politics. So that's the kind of the people they recruit from. At sort of a leadership cadre level, you see a lot of professors, you see a lot of professional revolutionaries, and the leadership level, we're talking about people who are in their 40s and 50s a lot of the time. These guys were present at the founding of Antifa in this country, which goes all the way back to the late 1980s in the foundation of something called Anti-Racist Action, which was recruited out of various punk rock music scenes, primarily beginning in the Midwest. And what was interesting about that was present at the founding of Anti-Racist Action was a group called the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. The John Brown Anti-Klan Committee helped the ARA get its start, organized them, and pointed them in a direction. That's interesting because the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was a front group for the May 19th Communist Organization, which was the last fringe holdouts of the Weather Underground, best known for the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Senate building and the 1981 Brinks armored car robbery. So you had really hardcore communist guerrillas from the late 70s and early 80s playing a role in the formation of what we now call Antifa today.
Okay, so there is a communist pedigree to this, as well as in terms of their guiding ideology, program, however you want to characterize it. To what extent does this bring them into a kind of not just alignment, but actual alliance with another group that has, at least at the leadership level, in terms of its broad direction, sort of a communist agenda as well, namely Black Lives Matter, Kyle?
Extremely close. If you look at a forming Antifa group manual, which is available online, that's for Director Ray if he wants to go look it up. It says explicitly that BLM is one of the organizations that Antifa exists to support and defend. They genuinely see themselves as defending and supporting efforts for Black liberation. If you look at the pedigree of BLM, BLM very much views itself as the natural successor to groups like the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panthers. This is interesting because if you go back to the history of the 70s and 80s, the Weather Underground and the May 19th Communist Organization saw themselves as supporters and facilitators of the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panthers. So you have, going all the way back, this history of cooperation. Now, what was interesting is in the past, Black Liberation Army, those guys were really the ones who were out in front. They were the ones who assassinated police officers, robbed banks, and the like. And the May 19th Communist Organization largely played a support role. They helped with logistics. They helped build explosives. They helped move people around the country. And what you're seeing nowadays is that Antifa is sort of playing the vanguard, tip of the spear, violent role. And BLM plays a far more larger support network role. So BLM pays for protests, they pay for busing, they pay to move people around the country. They have the large bail funds that get people out of jail. They have the media attention. And Antifa plays the role of raising the temperature and of committing the violence that allows them to get the media coverage that they need.
But there's definitely a synergy between the two. And
absolutely.
Might the explanation for the kind of role reversal here be that the Black Lives Matter folks calculated that if they play that sort of backstopping or logistic support role, they would be able to garner more funds from, among other places, corporate America, and thereby, be able to essentially pay for the more violent aspects of the revolution. Whereas if they were at the cutting edge of it, that would almost certainly be difficult for them to do.
Definitely part of it. I think it also has to do with the nature of where the country is on arguments about race and politics, that it made making BLM the front and center of it really reasonable. And you just can't convince people to give money to black garbed anarchists smashing windows, right? That's not gonna convince Nike to give you a couple $100 million. But BLM, racial justice, all these sorts of things are very appealing. They can collect a lot of money. That doesn't mean there aren't people on the BLM side who are violent and engage in violence. There absolutely are. But they are able to maintain a facade of respectability that Antifa can't. and doesn't understand.
Kyle Shideler, when you put all this together, and I know these are not the only groups that are in this space, but there are two prominent ones for sure. Does this really represent, in your estimation, the vanguard of a Marxist revolution within our country? And even though they've been somewhat quiet, they've not gone away by any means, but somewhat quiet in the past year since the summer of 2020's widespread, violent upheavals in city after city after city, that they're ready to go again if called to do so?
I mean, if you listen to the way they talk about their efforts, they absolutely describe themselves as an uprising. They describe what happened in 2020 as an uprising. They are willing to do it again. I think we'll see an uptick in violence as we get closer to 2022. There is some indications that they have suffered some losses. They have suffered some fracturing after the election in 2020 because I think some of the money that was flowing in has been reduced. So they're not getting the money and they're not getting the media attention that they were receiving in the past. But the way I look at it, that's a spigot or a faucet that can be turned on and off by some of these larger left-wing foundations and other groups. So there's definitely concern that if that spigot gets turned back on, that they would be capable of engaging in what they engaged in 2020. I think we have to absolutely assume that that's the case.
This brings to mind, and you sort of touched on it earlier on, that our law enforcement agencies these days are telling us that the single greatest threat to the security of the homeland of the United States is not from Antifa, not from Black Lives Matter, not from Black Lives Matter and Antifa's collusion. It's from so-called white supremacists, some of whom apparently, according to Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, are parents in American school board meetings complaining about what their kids are being taught. Does this strike you as a serious professional in this space as not only misunderstanding the threats that we're actually facing, but almost certainly as a result, misapplying resources to protect us against them?
Oh, I mean, without a doubt, the priorities of the federal law enforcement in this space are completely misaligned. This isn't to say that white supremacist groups don't exist, that there aren't white supremacists who engage in violence. But if you are federal law enforcement, if you're at the FBI, you need to be really looking at what is the largest threat to the Constitution and to the country. And it's not individual white supremacists who may engage in violence. The country can weather that, they can tolerate that. And actually, they're really pretty good at breaking up those kinds of threats and preventing them. What they are not very good at dealing with is this much broader based threat of the mixture of violence and political warfare that the hard left engages in. You know, a terrorist organization or a violent political organization which has people in Congress backing it and supporting it, making statements in defense of it, that has major media figures comparing them to the GIs at Normandy. This makes this threat much more dangerous than a bunch of losers in their basement that everybody in the country thinks, shouldn't have power and shouldn't be taken seriously.
Which brings me, Kyle, lastly to the trial of another Kyle Rittenhouse, young man who was trying to defend the community of Kenosha, Wisconsin, against these sorts of actors, Antifa notably, BLM I think as well, who were sacking the place at the time. He is, of course, as we speak, being prosecuted, and the jury is considering what seems to me to be a remarkable and extreme case of prosecutorial abuse. But I just wondered, one of the most serious legacies, it seems to me at least, of all of this, especially against the backdrop of what ensued on the 6th of January here in Washington, D.C., was a takeaway on the part of an awful lot of Americans who could not fathom why steps were not taken to break up or at least, penalize people doing this kind of harm to our country in the summer of 2020, in contrast to how those who trespassed in the Capitol, not excusing it, I'm just saying it was relatively small potatoes compared to what was being done by Antifa and BLM and so on the summer before. These January 6th folks have been really badly abused, imprisoned, solitary confinement for protracted periods of time in some cases. The question, I guess, to you, Kyle, is the rule of law, the idea that we're a nation of equal justice under the law, that they're not, people who get preferred treatment and others who get badly treated, is that now in tatters as a result of Antifa's operations and its friends? And if so, have they succeeded in some sense in their efforts to undermine our government?
I mean, I think one of the problems that we see really in the Rittenhouse case is evidence that this country really now has two different conceptions of what justice means. In the traditional American understanding of justice, a young man defending his life after being attacked, this would be a relative no-brainer. But in the new left conception of justice, which is a community-based justice, which is a social justice, if you will allow me to use their term, the only people who have a right to self-defense, the only people who have a right to act are those people acting in accordance with the left's preferred identity politics. So it is permissible to burn down Kenosha. It is permissible to riot and sack businesses. And when someone tries to stop you from engaging in a crime, and that's actually not even fair, because Rittenhouse didn't try to stop anyone from engaging in anything. He tried to put out fires that had been started by rioters, and they attacked him for it. Yeah. He didn't go there looking for trouble. He went there to help people who needed medical aid and to clean up graffiti and to put out fires. But if it is now legal and self-defense to start fires and illegal to put them out, which is sort of the moral story of the Rittenhouse case, that's very troublesome. And I think we are seeing that this idea of justice, that is the Antifa BLM idea of justice, really is infecting elements of mainstream politics today. And that is really the most dangerous threat. Yeah. It's not the violence that they create, it's the impact they have on politics.
And as I say, in a way, that could be a very significant win for people like Antifa, who you've done some epic work trying to unmask. Kyle Shideler, thank you very much for this book, for the work you do at the Center for Security Policy, and for this very helpful sort of distillation of your findings here at Secure Freedom Radio. I hope you'll come back to us with updates in the very near future. In the meantime, keep up the good work, my friend. Thank you so much for being with us. Next up, we're going to speak to Grant Newsom about the developments in China, the Xi-Biden summit, among other things, right after this.